Arnhem, the Netherlands, September 20th, 1944. A young lance corporal presses himself into the rubble of a shattered terraced house, 40 meters from a German self-propelled gun that is slowly traversing its barrel towards the British positions along the Lower Rhine. He has no rocket launcher. He has no explosive charge to hurl. What he carries is a strange, ungainly steel tube, spring-loaded like some grotesque children's toy, resting heavy and awkward across his shoulder. There is no backblast to give his position away, no telltale flash of rocket propellant lighting up the dusk. He braces the weapon against the ground, aims through a crude sight, and squeezes the trigger. A dull thud, barely louder than a car door closing, and a projectile the size of a rugby ball lumbers across the gap towards the German armour. Where it strikes, there is no explosion in the conventional sense, no shower of sparks. There is simply a jet of molten metal, travelling faster than a rifle bullet, punching clean through steel armour and turning the machine's interior into a furnace in the span of a heartbeat. The gun stops moving. This was the PIAT, the projector, infantry, anti-tank, and it remains one of the strangest, most maligned, and most quietly effective weapons Britain produced during the Second World War. To understand why such an unlikely contraption ever left the drawing board, you first have to understand the desperation from which it was born. This is not a story of gleaming laboratories and unlimited budgets. It is a story about ordinary infantrymen who, for years, had almost nothing to stop a tank with, and about the men in Whitehall who realized, rather too late, that something had to change. By 1940, the British Army's principal anti-tank weapon for the individual soldier was the boy's anti-tank rifle, a weapon that had seemed reasonable enough in the 1930s, but was rendered almost useless by the armored German tanks now carried. It fired a solid steel bullet that could, under favorable conditions, penetrate perhaps 20 millimeters of armor plate. German tanks arriving in France in 1940, and increasingly through the desert campaigns and beyond, carried armor considerably thicker than that. A soldier armed with a boy's rifle was, in effect, being asked to fight a losing battle with a weapon already obsolete before he had even fired it. The alternative for much of the early war was worse still. Infantrymen were issued sticky bombs, glass spheres coated in adhesive filled with nitroglycerin, that had to be thrown, or more often, physically pressed against a tank's hull by hand. The weapon was as dangerous to the man using it as to his target. The adhesive coating had an unfortunate habit of sticking to clothing, webbing, and uniforms rather than only to enemy steel. Reports from the field described soldiers essentially wrestling live explosive charges away from their own trousers before they could even attempt to use them properly. Losses among anti-tank teams, particularly during the retreat to Dunkirk and afterwards, were catastrophic, not merely from enemy fire, but from the sheer inadequacy of the tools they had been given. What was needed was something that could be carried and fired by a single soldier, that did not require him to close to point-blank range and physically attach an explosive to a moving target under fire, and that could reliably defeat the armor of contemporary German tanks. The Americans were working towards their own answer, the rocket-propelled bazooka, but rockets brought their own problems. A visible backblast that betrayed a firer's position instantly, propellant that performed poorly in cold or wet conditions, and a minimum safe range that made close quarters use in a ruined building or a hedgerow, dangerous to the user himself. Britain needed a solution that worked in the cramped, filthy conditions of European infantry combat, not merely on a testing range. By the middle of the war, with German armour growing thicker and more sophisticated by the month, the problem had become, in the words of more than one contemporary report, close to intractable. The man most associated with solving it was Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, working initially from ideas developed at the Projectile Development Establishment, with the design refined substantially by Major Millis Jefferies and the engineers of MD1, an obscure and semi-secret research establishment based at a country house called The Firs, near Whitchurch in Buckinghamshire. MD1 answered directly to Winston Churchill's scientific advisor, Major General Millis Jefferies, reporting through channels that bypassed much of the conventional military bureaucracy, which allowed the team an unusual freedom to pursue unconventional solutions. And the PIAT, when it emerged in 1942, was about as unconventional as British small arms design ever got. At its heart, the PIAT solved two problems simultaneously with a single piece of engineering. The first was propulsion. Rather than using explosive propellant charge to fire its projectile, as a rifle or a bazooka would, the PIAT used a colossal coiled spring housed within its tubular body, roughly the length and thickness of a man's forearm. Cocking the weapon required the firer to plant the butt against the ground, stand over it, and haul the entire body of the weapon upwards against the spring's resistance, using both hands and considerable body weight, an action that soldiers frequently compared to trying to bend a heavy iron bar. This alone made the PIAT notoriously difficult to prepare for a first shot, particularly for smaller or exhausted soldiers, and it became something of a grim regimental joke that the weapon required a man to nearly dislocate his own shoulder before it would even consider working. Once cocked, the spring drove a heavy metal spigot forward inside the tube when the trigger was released. This spigot struck the base of the bomb, a hollow tail containing a small propellant cartridge, launching the projectile forward while simultaneously recocking the spring, using the recoil of that very small charge for the next shot. It was an elegant, if brutal, piece of mechanical recycling, and it meant the PIAT required no separate propellant reservoir, no gas cylinder, nothing that could be damaged by rain, mud, or the general chaos of a battlefield in France or Italy. The second, and arguably more significant innovation, was the projectile itself. The bomb carried a hollow or shaped explosive charge, a design principle in which the explosive is molded around a cone-shaped metal liner. On detonation, that liner collapses inward and is projected forward as a narrow, extraordinarily fast jet of metal, traveling at speeds exceeding several kilometers per second, concentrated onto a point smaller than a coin. This jet does not rely on brute explosive force to smash through armor. It essentially erodes and punches a narrow channel through solid steel using focused kinetic energy, in the way a jet of water under sufficient pressure can cut through stone. The PIAT's bomb, weighing around 1.1 kilograms, could penetrate approximately 100 millimeters of armor plate, sufficient to deal with the great majority of German tanks a British infantryman was likely to encounter, and devastating against the concrete and brick of a fortified bunker or pillbox, where the jet would punch clean through the wall and detonate secondary ammunition or fuel stored inside. Manufacture was relatively straightforward and cheap by wartime standards, since the weapon required no precision machined barrel to withstand high-pressure propellant gases, only the tube, the spigot, and the powerful spring assembly. Production was spread across various British engineering firms, and by the time of the Normandy landings, the weapon was standard issue at a scale of roughly 1 PIAT per infantry platoon, though exact wartime production figures remain somewhat inconsistent between surviving records, with estimates for total output running to well over 100,000 units by war's end. In the field, the PIAT earned a reputation that was, in equal measure, grudging and remarkable. Soldiers loathed cocking it and distrusted its notoriously unpredictable minimum range. But time and again, it delivered results the numbers alone struggled to convey. During the fighting at Arnhem in September 1944, PIAT teams from the 1st Airborne Division destroyed a string of German armored vehicles in the close rubble-strewn streets around the town, conditions in which a rocket weapon's backblast would have given away every firing position within seconds. Lance Sergeant John Baskyfield of the South Staffordshire Regiment used a PIAT to knock out 2 tanks and a self-propelled gun in a single engagement at Arnhem before being killed manning the weapon alone, an action for which he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. In Italy and in Normandy's Bocage country, where hedgerows and stone farm buildings created exactly the kind of short-range, ambush-style fighting the PIAT was suited to, similar stories recur throughout regimental histories, though many individual actions went entirely unrecorded, since infantry combat at that scale rarely made its way into official reports. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might think, and it costs nothing at all. If you're finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. There is a strange domesticity running through the whole enterprise that is worth dwelling on, because it captures something of how total the mobilization of British industry had become by this stage of the war. The firm making the cake itself, Olympia Oil and Cake, was a perfectly ordinary supplier of animal feed with no history of military contracting. The firm cutting the cakes to size, Atkinson's, was a soap manufacturer, chosen presumably because its machinery for producing small, uniform, pressed items translated neatly enough to the task at hand. Neither business, as far as the historical record shows, was ever told the true purpose of what it was producing, and the compartmentalized secrecy that kept ordinary tradesmen in the dark about the ultimate use of their work was itself a hallmark of how Britain's wartime scientific establishment operated. It is a reminder that the country's most secret weapons programs did not always run through purpose-built military factories staffed by uniformed personnel. Often, as with the sticky bombs and explosive devices produced elsewhere in Churchill's shadow arms industry, they ran through the back rooms of civilian businesses that had simply been asked, without much explanation, to make something small, precise, and in very large numbers. Set against what else the belligerents of the Second World War were attempting, Operation Vegetarian occupies an unusual place. Germany, despite British fears, never seriously pursued offensive biological weapons on anything like this scale. Hitler himself was said to have a personal aversion to the idea, reportedly rooted in his own experience of being gassed as a young soldier in the previous war. And while German scientists did conduct some biological research, it never approached the industrial ambition of the British cattle cake program, the most extensive and horrifying biological weapons effort of the entire war, instead belonged to Imperial Japan, whose Unit 731 in occupied Manchuria conducted biological experiments directly on prisoners of war and civilians, and whose forces deployed plague-infected fleas and contaminated food against Chinese towns and villages, killing an estimated tens of thousands of people, mostly civilians, through outbreaks that in some cases continued to claim lives for years afterwards. Compared with that, the British program was, in the grimmest possible sense, more restrained. It targeted livestock rather than people directly, and critically, it was never actually deployed. The Americans, for their part, ran their own eccentric parallel research, most famously an experimental program to strap small incendiary devices to bats in the hope they would roost inside Japanese buildings before detonating, a scheme that consumed considerable resources without ever reaching operational use. None of the major powers in the end unleashed a large-scale biological attack on an enemy population during the war. Britain's cattle cakes came, by most historical assessments, closer to being used than almost anything else in that grim category, kept back not by any single technical failure, but by circumstance and by a change in the military situation that made the weapon, mercifully, unnecessary. That circumstance arrived in the spring and summer of 1944. Operation Vegetarian had originally been penciled in for deployment that spring, contingent only on a final go-ahead from Churchill himself. But by the time the stockpile and the aircraft modifications were ready, the Normandy landings had already begun, and Allied forces were advancing rapidly across northern France. The strategic logic that had justified the program, the need for some means of striking a crippling, asymmetric blow against a Germany that otherwise looked unbeatable, had simply evaporated. Germany was now visibly losing the war through conventional means. The order to proceed was never given. Fildes and his team stood down. The aircraft modifications were quietly abandoned, and the millions of cakes already produced sat in storage, an enormous and highly dangerous liability with no purpose left to serve. It is what happened next that gives this story its title. With the weapon now surplus to requirements, and with a live biological agent that nobody wanted found in a government warehouse once the war was over, the decision was taken to destroy the entire stockpile. In 1945, in the months immediately following the German surrender, the 5 million cattle cakes were fed into an incinerator at Porton Down under close supervision and burned to nothing. The order came from the very top of a government that had, only months earlier, been prepared to scatter every one of them across German farmland. It was done quietly, without announcement, and the details of the program were kept firmly under official secrecy for decades afterwards, unacknowledged in public records until historians and journalists began piecing the story together from declassified files many years later. Cruinard Island, meanwhile, remained the one visible, undeniable scar the program left behind, a patch of British territory too dangerous for its own citizens to set foot on. The island's eventual fate says something about how seriously the contamination was taken. For decades, government scientists periodically tested the soil, always finding viable anthrax spores still present, sometimes in numbers barely diminished from the original test. It was not until 1986, following growing public pressure and a headline-grabbing act of civil disobedience by a group calling itself the Dark Harvest Commandos, who removed contaminated soil samples from the island and left them outside a government building and a political party conference to force the issue that a serious decontamination effort finally began. Teams treated the island's 200 acres with a combination of seawater and formaldehyde solution over roughly 4 years at a cost of several £1,000,000 before Gruinard was formally declared safe in 1990 and sold back to the descendants of its original owners for the token sum first agreed decades before. The visible legacy of Operation Vegetarian, in other words, outlasted the war that produced it by almost half a century. The wider legacy is harder to measure, and historians remain divided on how to weigh it. As a weapon, Operation Vegetarian was never fired in anger, so its practical military impact was precisely zero. Its psychological impact is equally difficult to assess, since the entire point of the secrecy that surrounded it was that almost nobody on either side knew it existed. What it does illustrate, starkly, is the sheer scale of destruction that Britain was prepared to contemplate at a moment when national survival genuinely felt uncertain, and the ease with which conventional moral limits could be set aside under sufficient pressure. Some historians argue the program played a quiet role in shaping post-war thinking on biological weapons generally, feeding into the international unease that eventually produced the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, the treaty under which the vast majority of the world's states agreed never to develop offensive biological arsenals again. Others are more skeptical, pointing out that Britain's own decision to abandon offensive biological research did not come until 1956, and was driven as much by the arrival of nuclear weapons as by any change of conscience. What is not in dispute is the physical evidence. Visitors to the Porton Down Science Museum in Wiltshire and to archives held by the Imperial War Museum can today see declassified footage, documents and photographs from the Gruinard trials, alongside the sanitized, carefully worded language the government used at the time to describe a program it hoped nobody would ever have to explain. Return for a moment to that boat crossing the water off Gruinard, to the sheep standing in the July sunshine with no idea what was coming. That single afternoon in 1942 proved, beyond any scientific doubt, that Britain possessed the means to make vast tracts of enemy territory permanently uninhabitable, to attack not soldiers, but food, not armies, but entire populations at one remove. It proved it so completely that the island itself became unusable for the better part of half a century, a stretch of Britain's own coastline sacrificed to a weapon aimed in the end at nobody. 5 million cattle cakes were built for a war that ended before they were needed, and every last one of them was fed into a furnace on Churchill's watch and left out of the history books for a generation afterwards. It remains, arguably, the most effective weapon Britain built and never used, effective enough to work exactly as designed on the one occasion it was tried, and dangerous enough that the people who built it decided the safest thing to do with it was to make sure it never existed at all.